David Miller sat in his worn leather chair, staring at the empty spot on the couch where his wife used to curl up with her mystery novels every evening. The house felt too quiet, too empty, like all the life had been sucked out of it 3 months ago when the cancer finally won its battle against Lisa. He rubbed his tired eyes and looked around the living room. Everything was exactly the same as the day she passed away. Her coffee mug still sat on the side table, a faint ring staining the wood underneath. Her reading glasses lay folded on top of the last book she never got to finish. Even her favorite throw blanket remained draped over the arm of the sofa, still holding the shape of where she used to rest her feet. David was 58 years old, a retired auto mechanic who had spent 35 years fixing other people's problems under the hood of their cars. But this problem, this crushing loneliness that followed him from room to room, he couldn't figure out how to fix. He had tried everything people suggested. He joined a grief support group, but sitting in a circle talking about feelings made him uncomfortable. He tried staying busy with home projects, but every repair reminded him that Lisa wasn't there to hand him tools or bring him sweet tea. The phone used to ring constantly in those first few weeks. Friends from church would call to check on him. His neighbor would stop by with casseroles. His brother would drive over from the next town just to sit and watch television together. But as time passed, the calls became less frequent. The visits stopped altogether. Everyone else had moved on with their lives, but David felt stuck in that hospital room, holding Lisa's hand as she took her last breath. Sleep had become his enemy. Every night he would lie in their bed on his side, staring at the empty space where Lisa used to sleep. Sometimes he would reach over, forgetting for just a moment that she wasn't there anymore. The disappointment hit him fresh every single time. He had started sleeping in his chair most nights just to avoid the painful reminder of her absence. The mornings were the worst. For 42 years of marriage, Lisa had been the first one up, making coffee and humming while she prepared breakfast. The smell of bacon and eggs would drift into their bedroom, along with the sound of morning news on the kitchen television. Now David woke up to silence. Complete heavy silence that seemed to press down on his chest like a weight. He had stopped eating regular meals. What was the point of cooking for one person? Most days he managed some toast or a sandwich, maybe a can of soup if he remembered. The refrigerator, once full of Lisa's home-cooked meals and fresh ingredients, now held only the basics. Milk that usually went sour before he finished it, bread that went stale, and leftovers from well-meaning neighbors that he rarely touched. The grocery store had become a nightmare. Every aisle held memories. The cereal Lisa liked but he never touched. The brand of ice cream they used to share while watching old movies. The flowers she would pick up just because they made her smile. He had taken to shopping at odd hours, usually late at night when the store was nearly empty, just to avoid seeing couples shopping together or families with children. Church was another painful reminder of his loss. David and Lisa had sat in the same pew for 20 years, third row from the front, right side. After the funeral, people were kind and supportive, but sitting alone in that pew felt wrong. He tried different spots in the sanctuary, but nothing felt right without Lisa beside him, whispering comments about the sermon or reminding him to put money in the collection plate. His daily routine had shrunk to almost nothing. He would wake up whenever exhaustion finally released him from his chair. Make coffee that always tasted wrong because Lisa had been the one who knew exactly how to make it just right. Check the mailbox, though most of the mail was still addressed to both of them, which felt like small punches to his heart. Watch television without really seeing what was on the screen, then back to his chair to wait for another day to end. The house itself seemed to be mourning too. The garden Lisa had lovingly tended was overgrown with weeds. The bird feeders she had kept filled were empty, and the birds had stopped coming. Even the neighbor's dog, who used to visit daily for treats from Lisa, had stopped jumping the fence into their yard. David found himself talking to Lisa throughout the day, asking her opinion about what to have for lunch or telling her about something he saw on the news. Sometimes he caught himself setting 2 plates on the table or calling out to tell her the phone was ringing. The realization that she wasn't there to answer hit him over and over again, fresh each time. His brother had suggested he consider dating eventually, maybe join some social groups for people his age. The idea made David feel sick to his stomach. How could anyone replace 42 years of shared memories, inside jokes, and comfortable silence? How could he explain to someone new that he still reached for Lisa's hand when he was nervous? Or that he saved funny stories throughout the day to tell her when she got home from work, even though she never would again? The nights were filled with dreams about Lisa. Sometimes they were beautiful dreams where she was healthy and young, and they were planning their future together. But he always woke up and the reality crashed down on him like a cold wave. Other times, the dreams were about the illness, about watching her fade away despite all the treatments and hope and prayers. Those dreams left him shaking and unable to fall back asleep. Money wasn't a problem. David had his pension and Social Security, and the house was paid off. But what good was financial security when every day felt like a struggle just to get through? He had started thinking dangerous thoughts, wondering if anyone would really miss him if he just disappeared. His brother would be sad, sure, but he had his own family to worry about. The few friends he had left would probably understand. They might even think it was romantic the way he couldn't live without his beloved wife. These dark thoughts scared David, but they also brought him a strange kind of comfort. If there was a way to stop feeling this crushing sadness, this bone-deep loneliness that never seemed to ease, maybe he should consider it. Maybe some people just weren't meant to go on alone. Maybe Lisa was waiting for him somewhere, and all he had to do was find the courage to go to her. As winter settled over the small town where David had lived his entire adult life, he began to make a plan. It wasn't a cry for help or a dramatic gesture. It was simply the practical decision of a man who couldn't figure out how to live without the person who had been his whole world for more than half his life. The idea came to David on a particularly difficult Tuesday morning in February. He had woken up at 3 a.m. from another dream about Lisa, this one so vivid that he could still smell her perfume when he opened his eyes. The empty bedroom felt like a tomb, and the silence was so complete it seemed to have weight. David made his way to the kitchen and sat at the table where he and Lisa had shared thousands of meals together. The morning light filtered through the curtains she had sewn by hand, casting shadows that reminded him of all the mornings they had planned their day over coffee and toast. But this morning there was no planning to do. No shared schedule to coordinate. No reason to even get dressed if he didn't want to. He opened the local newspaper more out of habit than interest. The classified section fell open in front of him, and his eyes wandered over the usual collection of used cars, furniture, and job listings that no longer applied to his retired life. But then something caught his attention in the firearm section. A simple 3-line advertisement that seemed to jump off the page. Hunting rifle for sale. Excellent condition. Private seller. Call for details. David stared at the advertisement for a long time. He wasn't a hunter and never had been. Lisa had always been against having guns in the house, worried about accidents or break-ins where the weapon could be turned against them. But Lisa wasn't here anymore to worry about such things. The practical part of his mind, the part that had spent decades solving mechanical problems, began to work through the details. A rifle would be quick and certain. There would be no chance of surviving and ending up worse off than before. No risk of being found and forced into counseling or hospitals or well-meaning relatives moving in to watch over him. It would be over, and then maybe he could find Lisa again. David folded the newspaper carefully and set it aside. He spent the rest of the morning trying to distract himself with television and household chores, but his eyes kept returning to that folded newspaper on the kitchen table. By afternoon, he had convinced himself that at least looking into it wouldn't hurt anyone. Just gathering information, just exploring his options. He called the number from his kitchen phone, the same yellow rotary phone he and Lisa had installed when they first moved into the house. A man answered on the third ring, his voice rough and suspicious until David explained he was interested in the rifle. "Yeah, I got several available," the man said. His name was Ray, and he lived about 20 miles outside of town on what he called a hobby farm. "You can come take a look tomorrow afternoon if you want. Cash only, and bring identification for the background check paperwork." David agreed to meet Ray the next day at 2 o'clock. After he hung up the phone, he sat quietly in his kitchen, surprised by how calm he felt. For the first time in months, he had a plan, a sense of purpose, even if it was a dark one. Tomorrow he would drive out to Ray's farm, look at the rifle, and make a decision about his future. That evening, David did something he hadn't done since Lisa died. He cooked himself a real dinner. Nothing fancy, Just a pork chop with mashed potatoes and green beans from a can, but it was the first complete meal he had prepared for himself in months. He ate slowly, thinking about Lisa and all the dinners they had shared at the same table. He wondered if she would understand what he was planning, or if she would be disappointed in him for giving up. Sleep came easier that night than it had in weeks. David's mind, usually spinning with grief and regret, was focused on the practical details of his trip tomorrow. What time he would leave, which route he would take, how much cash he should bring. The mechanical process of planning helped quiet the emotional chaos that usually kept him awake. Wednesday morning arrived gray and cold, with the kind of winter weather that made staying inside seem like the only reasonable option. But David got up early, showered and shaved carefully, and put on his best pair of jeans and a clean shirt. If this was going to be one of his last days, he wanted to look respectable. He counted out $300 from his savings, money that had been sitting untouched in their joint checking account since Lisa's death. The bank statement still came addressed to both of them. Another small reminder of the life he was preparing to leave behind. The drive to Ray's place took him through parts of the county David hadn't visited in years. Rolling farmland stretched out on both sides of the two-lane highway, brown and dormant under the winter sky. He passed old barns and farmhouses, some well-maintained and others falling into disrepair. It was peaceful country, the kind of place where neighbors still waved at each other and where people left their doors unlocked. David found himself thinking about his childhood. Growing up on his grandfather's farm not far from here, those had been simple times when his biggest worry was whether he would finish his chores in time to go fishing with his friends. Life had seemed full of possibilities then. He had never imagined ending up alone at 58, driving to meet a stranger about buying a gun to end his own suffering. Ray's property was easy to find, marked by a rusty mailbox and a long gravel driveway that wound through bare trees toward a modest farmhouse. The place looked tired, like it had seen better days but was still hanging on. A few chickens scratched around in the yard, and an old dog lifted his head from the porch to watch David's truck approach. As David parked and walked toward the house, he felt a strange mixture of nervousness and relief. This was really happening. After months of just existing, just getting through each day without purpose, he was finally taking action. It might not be the kind of action anyone would approve of, but it was movement forward, and that felt better than the endless standing still he had been doing since Lisa's death. Ray appeared on the porch before David could knock, a thin man in his 40s wearing work clothes and a suspicious expression. He looked David over carefully, taking in his neat appearance and nervous demeanor. "You the fellow who called about the rifle?" Ray asked. David nodded. "That's right. David Miller. We spoke yesterday." Ray studied him for another moment, then stepped down from the porch. "Well, come on then. I keep the firearms in the barn where they stay dry. Got several options depending on what you're looking for." As they walked toward the barn, Ray asked casual questions about David's hunting experience and what kind of game he was planning to pursue. David gave vague answers, claiming he was just getting back into hunting after many years away from it. The lies came easier than he expected, probably because they were serving such a definite purpose. The barn was larger than it looked from outside, with high ceilings and the smell of hay and motor oil. Ray led him toward the back corner, where several rifles were displayed on a makeshift table made from sawhorses and plywood. David's heart began beating faster as they approached the weapons, knowing that one of them might be the tool that would finally end his pain and reunite him with Lisa. Ray led David through the barn, past old farm equipment and stacks of hay bales that looked like they had been sitting there for years. The building creaked and groaned in the winter wind, and David noticed that several of the windows had been covered with plywood, making the interior darker than it should have been even on a cloudy afternoon. "Here's what I got available," Ray said, gesturing toward the makeshift table where 5 or 6 rifles lay in various states of condition. "This one here's real popular with hunters." He picked up a bolt-action rifle and handed it to David. "Good for deer. Reliable, hardly been used." David took the weapon, surprised by its weight and the way it felt both foreign and familiar in his hands. He had handled firearms during his brief stint in the military 40 years ago, but that felt like a different lifetime. Back then, guns were just tools for training exercises. Now, this rifle represented something much more personal and final. As Ray launched into a detailed explanation of the rifle's features, David found himself only half listening. Something about the man made him uncomfortable, though he couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was. Ray's eyes never seemed to focus on David directly, always glancing around the barn or checking over his shoulder toward the farmhouse. His hands shook slightly when he demonstrated how to work the rifle's action, and he kept wiping his palms on his jeans. "You live out here alone?" David asked, trying to make conversation while he examined the rifle. "Yeah, just me and the animals," Ray replied quickly. "Quiet life, you know? Like my privacy." He laughed, but it sounded forced and nervous. "That's why I like dealing with private sales. No need to involve all those government agencies and paperwork if we don't have to." David nodded, though something about Ray's attitude toward paperwork struck him as odd. Every legal gun sale required documentation, even between private parties. But David wasn't looking to cause trouble for anyone, and if Ray wanted to handle things informally, that actually worked better for David's purposes. "How much for this one?" David asked, hefting the rifle again. $250, and that includes a box of ammunition," Ray said. "Good deal for a weapon in this condition." As they negotiated the price, David became aware of sounds coming from elsewhere in the barn. At first he dismissed them as normal farm noises, maybe animals moving around or equipment settling in the cold. But as he listened more carefully, the sounds seemed different. More rhythmic, almost like someone tapping or knocking on wood. Ray must have noticed David's attention wandering, because he suddenly became more animated in his sales pitch. "Tell you what, let me show you another option that might interest you," he said, moving toward a different rifle. "This one's got a better scope, more accurate for long-distance shots." But David was having trouble concentrating on Ray's words. The tapping sound had stopped, but now he could swear he heard something else, a scraping noise like metal against concrete, coming from the back corner of the barn where the lighting was poorest. "Is someone else here?" David asked, looking around the barn's interior. Ray's face went pale for just a moment before he forced another unconvincing laugh. "Nah, just the two of us. Probably just the wind rattling something loose. Old buildings make all kinds of noises." He gestured toward the rifles again. "So what do you think? Either of these catching your interest?" David tried to focus on the decision he had come here to make, but his attention kept drifting toward the back of the barn. The scraping sound had resumed, and now it was accompanied by what sounded almost like a muffled voice. Very quiet, barely audible over the wind outside, but definitely there. "What's back there?" David asked, pointing toward the dark corner where the sound seemed to be originating. "Just storage," Ray said too quickly. "Old equipment, feed supplies, nothing interesting." He moved to position himself between David and the back of the barn. "Say, you seem like a serious buyer. Why don't I give you a better price on that first rifle? $200 even, and I'll throw in extra ammunition." The sudden price drop might have seemed like good news, but it only made David more suspicious. Combined with Ray's nervous behavior and the strange sounds, David was beginning to feel like this transaction was more complicated than a simple gun sale. His instincts, honed by decades of reading people's reactions when they brought their cars to his shop, were telling him something was very wrong here. "I need to think about it," David said, setting the rifle back on the table. "This is a big purchase for me." Ray's expression darkened. "Look, friend, I don't get many customers out here. You drove all this way, I gave you my time and a good price. Least you could do is make a decision." The change in Ray's tone was dramatic and unsettling. The nervous friendliness was gone, replaced by something that sounded almost threatening. David felt his heart rate increase, but not with the anticipation he had expected. Instead, he felt the old wariness that had kept him safe during his younger years in rougher neighborhoods. "Just let me look around a bit more," David said, trying to keep his voice casual. "I want to make sure I'm getting the right weapon for my needs." Before Ray could object, David started walking toward the back of the barn, following the source of the sounds he had been hearing. Ray hurried after him, talking rapidly about the benefits of making a quick decision and the difficulties of storing firearms in damp conditions. But David wasn't listening anymore. As his eyes adjusted to the dimmer light in the back corner, he could make out shapes that didn't belong in a typical farm storage area. What looked like heavy blankets or tarps hung from the ceiling, creating a makeshift wall or partition, and from behind that partition the sounds were much clearer now. Someone was definitely back there. Someone who was trying very hard to be quiet but couldn't quite manage complete silence. David heard the scraping sound again, followed by what was unmistakably a human sigh or sob. "You know what? I really think you should stick to the front of the barn," Ray said, his voice tight with anxiety. Insurance issues, you understand. Can't have customers wandering around unsupervised. David stopped walking but didn't turn around. His mind was racing, trying to process what he was experiencing. He had come here with one purpose, focused entirely on his own problems and his plan to end his suffering. But now he was faced with evidence that someone else might be in serious trouble, right here, right now. The practical part of his mind told him to just buy a rifle and leave. Whatever was happening in Ray's barn wasn't his business, and getting involved would only complicate the simple plan he had made. But another part of him, a part that had been dormant since Lisa's death, was stirring to life. That part remembered what it felt like to help people, to solve problems, to be needed. "Ray," David said slowly, still facing away from the nervous man, "what exactly do you keep stored back there?" The silence that followed his question seemed to last forever. David could hear Ray breathing heavily behind him, could almost feel the man's internal struggle playing out in the cold air of the barn. When Ray finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Nothing that concerns you, old man. Just buy your rifle and get out of here." But David was beyond the point where he could simply walk away. The sounds from behind the partition had stopped completely, as if whoever was back there was holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. David realized that his own breath was visible in the cold air, and that his hands were shaking, not with grief for the first time in months, but with adrenaline. David stood frozen in the dim light of the barn's back corner, his heart pounding as he tried to process the situation unfolding around him. Ray's demeanor had completely changed from nervous salesman to something much darker and more threatening. The silence from behind the makeshift partition was complete now, as if whoever was back there had heard Ray's warning and was afraid to make another sound. "I think I should go," David said, turning slowly to face Ray. But the man was no longer the jittery, eager seller from a few minutes ago. His face had hardened, and his right hand rested on something David couldn't quite see tucked into his waistband. "Yeah, you should," Ray said, his voice flat and cold. "But first we need to understand each other. You didn't see anything here. You didn't hear anything here. You came out to look at rifles, didn't find what you wanted, and left. That's the only story that makes sense." David's mind raced. Every instinct told him that someone behind that partition needed help, but Ray was clearly prepared to do whatever it took to protect his secret. David was unarmed on Ray's property, miles from help, with no one expecting him home at any particular time. If he disappeared, it might be days before anyone noticed. "I understand," David said carefully. "I'll just head back to town now." Ray relaxed slightly but kept his hand near his waistband. "Good choice. Let me walk you back to your truck." As they moved toward the front of the barn, David's mind worked frantically to figure out what to do. The smart thing would be to leave, drive straight to the police station and report what he had heard. But what had he actually heard? Some scraping sounds and what might have been a human sigh. Would the police even take that seriously enough to investigate? And what would happen to whoever was back there in the time it took to convince law enforcement to act? They had almost reached the barn door when Ray suddenly stopped. "Wait here," he said. "I forgot something in the house. Don't move until I get back." Ray jogged toward the farmhouse, leaving David alone in the barn for the first time since he had arrived. This was his chance, maybe his only chance, to find out what was really happening here. David looked toward the front door, calculating how quickly he could reach his truck if he needed to run. Then he looked toward the back corner where the partition hid whatever Ray was so desperate to keep secret. The partition was only about 30 feet away. David could be there and back in less than a minute if he moved quickly. Without allowing himself time to reconsider, he walked rapidly toward the back corner, his footsteps muffled by the hay scattered on the barn floor. Up close, the partition was clearly makeshift but effective. Heavy canvas tarps had been hung from the rafters and weighted down with concrete blocks, creating a small enclosed space about the size of a horse stall. David could see gaps between the tarps, and he pressed his face close to one of the larger openings to peer inside. What he saw made his blood run cold. In the corner of the enclosed space, huddled on a pile of old blankets, was a young woman. She appeared to be in her early 20s, with long, dark hair that looked like it hadn't been washed in weeks. Her clothes were torn and dirty, and even in the dim light, David could see that she was painfully thin. But it was her eyes that hit him the hardest. They were wide with terror, but when she saw him looking through the gap, a flicker of desperate hope crossed her face. The woman was clearly imprisoned. Heavy chains connected to shackles around her ankles were bolted to the concrete floor. A bucket in the corner served as her bathroom, and a few empty food containers suggested she was being kept barely alive. The smell of fear and desperation was overwhelming. "Help me," she whispered so quietly that David almost didn't hear her. "Please help me." David's hands shook as he pressed closer to the gap in the partition. "What's your name?" he whispered back. "Amy," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Amy Chen, I've been here for, I don't know how long. Months. Please don't leave me here." "How did you get here?" David asked, though he was already afraid he knew the answer. "He took me from the parking lot at the mall," Amy said. "I was walking to my car after work. He said he needed directions, and when I went to help him, he forced me into his van. I've been here ever since." David felt sick to his stomach. This wasn't just imprisonment, it was kidnapping and probably much worse. Amy looked like she had been through hell, and David couldn't even imagine what Ray had been doing to her during the months she had been missing. "Listen to me," David said urgently, knowing that Ray could return from the house at any moment. "I'm going to get you out of here. I'm going to get help." "He'll kill me if he thinks I talked to someone," Amy said, panic rising in her voice. "He's told me what he'll do if anyone ever finds me. Please, you have to be careful." "I will be," David promised, "but I'm not going to leave you here. Can you hold on a little longer?" Amy nodded, wiping tears from her face with hands that David now realized were also shackled together with a short chain. "I've been holding on this whole time, hoping someone would find me. I almost gave up hoping." David could hear Ray's footsteps approaching the barn. "I have to go now, but I'm coming back for you. I promise. And what's your name?" Amy whispered as David pulled back from the gap. "David," he said, "and I'm going to get you home." David moved quickly back toward the front of the barn, his mind reeling from what he had just discovered. He had come here planning to end his own life, convinced that nothing mattered anymore and that no one needed him. But now he had found someone who desperately needed his help. Someone whose life depended on his actions in the next few hours. Ray appeared in the barn doorway just as David reached the rifle table. "Everything okay in here?" Ray asked suspiciously, looking around the barn as if he could sense that something had changed. "Just looking at that rifle one more time," David said, surprised by how steady his voice sounded. "But I think you're right about it being more than I need." Ray studied David's face carefully, looking for any sign that he had discovered the secret in the back corner. David forced himself to meet Ray's gaze, knowing that Amy's life might depend on his ability to convince this man that he had seen and heard nothing suspicious. "Yeah, well, maybe it's for the best," Ray said finally. "Hunting's not for everyone." As they walked toward David's truck, David's mind was already working on a plan. He couldn't go to the police, not yet. By the time he convinced them to take action, Ray might panic and do something terrible to Amy. And he couldn't simply call 911 from his cell phone, because there was no cell service this far out in the country. David was going to have to handle this himself, at least initially. He was going to have to find a way to free Amy before Ray realized that his secret had been discovered. And he was going to have to do it soon because he had seen the fear in Amy's eyes and knew that she was running out of time. For the first time since Lisa's death, David had a purpose that was bigger than his own pain. Someone needed him, really needed him, and failure wasn't an option. David drove away from Ray's farm in a daze, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had turned white. The image of Amy's terrified face kept flashing through his mind, along with her desperate whisper for help. Everything, about his day, his week. His entire plan had just changed completely in the span of a few minutes. He pulled over at a gas station about 5 miles down the road, needing time to think and process what he had just witnessed. The parking lot was nearly empty, just a few travelers stopping for fuel and snacks. David sat in his truck with the engine running, staring at nothing while his mind raced through possibilities and consequences. 3 hours ago, he had been a broken man planning to end his own suffering. He had been convinced that his life no longer had meaning, that no one needed him, and that joining Lisa was the only path forward that made sense. But now he had stumbled into a situation where someone's survival depended entirely on his actions. Amy Chen was counting on him whether she realized it or not. David pulled out his cell phone and confirmed what he already knew. No signal. Even if he had been able to call 911, what would he tell them? That he had heard strange noises and glimpsed a woman through a gap in some canvas? Would they even believe him? And how long would it take for them to get a search warrant and organize a response? Hours, maybe days. Amy might not have that kind of time. The smart thing to do would be to drive back to town, find the police station, and report everything he had seen. Let the professionals handle it. David was 58 years old with a bad back and no law enforcement experience. What could he possibly do against a man who was clearly dangerous and desperate enough to kidnap and imprison a young woman? But as David sat in the gas station parking lot, he kept thinking about the hope that had flickered in Amy's eyes when she saw him. Someone had finally found her after months of captivity and terror. Someone knew she was there. For the first time since her abduction, rescue was a real possibility. How could he walk away from that? David thought about Lisa and what she would have wanted him to do. She had always been the one who brought home stray cats and donated to every charity that asked. She volunteered at the soup kitchen and organized care packages for military families overseas. Lisa believed that when you had the ability to help someone in desperate need, you had a responsibility to act. "What would you do, sweetheart?" David said aloud, addressing the empty passenger seat where Lisa used to sit during their drives around the countryside. He could almost hear her voice telling him that Amy was someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone who deserved to go home to her family. Lisa would never be able to live with herself if she walked away from someone in that kind of danger. And David realized that he couldn't live with himself either if he took the safe route and something happened to Amy while he was waiting for official help to arrive. David pulled back onto the highway and drove toward town, but instead of heading to the police station, he stopped at the hardware store where he had been a customer for 30 years. The owner, Bob Martinez, knew David well and didn't ask any questions when David purchased bolt cutters, a heavy flashlight, and a crowbar. David paid cash and kept the conversation brief, claiming he had some repairs to do around his property. Next, David stopped at his own house to gather supplies and think through his plan more carefully. He loaded a thermos with hot coffee, grabbed some energy bars and a first aid kit, and changed into dark clothing. He also retrieved a hunting knife that had belonged to his father, even though he hoped he wouldn't need it. As evening approached, David realized he was more focused and energized than he had been since Lisa's diagnosis. The crushing depression that had been his constant companion for months was still there, but it had been pushed aside by something stronger. Purpose. Amy needed him, and for the first time in a long time, David felt like his actions really mattered. He drove back toward Ray's farm, parking his truck about a mile away on a side road where it wouldn't be visible from the main highway. David had spent 2 years in the Army when he was young, and while that was decades ago, some skills never completely fade. He knew how to move quietly through rough terrain and how to observe without being seen. The sun was setting as David made his way through the woods that bordered Ray's property. He moved slowly and carefully, stopping frequently to listen for any sounds that might indicate Ray's location. The farmhouse showed lights in several windows, and David could see the glow of a television through the front room curtains. David settled into a position where he could watch both the house and the barn, using the bolt cutters to clear a small opening through a fence that blocked his view. He would wait until Ray was settled for the evening, then make his move. The plan was simple: get into the barn, free Amy, and get her to safety before Ray realized what was happening. As he waited in the cold February evening, David found himself thinking about how different this day had turned out from what he had planned. This morning he had been ready to die, convinced that his life was over and meaningless. Now he was hiding in the woods, preparing to risk everything to save a stranger who was depending on him. The irony wasn't lost on him. In trying to end his own story, he had stumbled into the middle of someone else's desperate chapter. Amy's nightmare could end tonight if he succeeded, or it could get infinitely worse if he failed. The weight of that responsibility should have been terrifying, but instead it felt like awakening from a long, dark sleep. David watched Ray's farmhouse for over 2 hours, learning the man's evening routine. Ray moved from room to room with the jerky, nervous energy David had noticed earlier. Twice, Ray came out to the barn with a flashlight, staying inside for 10 or 15 minutes before returning to the house. David assumed these were visits to check on Amy, making sure she was still secure and alive. Around 10 o'clock, the lights in the farmhouse began going out one by one. Ray appeared to be settling in for the night, which meant David's opportunity was coming. He checked his supplies one more time. Bolt cutters, flashlight, crowbar, first aid kit, and his father's old hunting knife. Not much of an arsenal, but it would have to be enough. David had no illusions about what he was attempting. If Ray discovered him in the act of freeing Amy, there would be a confrontation, and David might not survive it. But for the first time, since Lisa's death, the possibility of dying didn't seem like the worst thing that could happen. The worst thing would be leaving Amy in that makeshift prison, knowing he could have tried to save her but chose safety instead. As David prepared to move toward the barn, he thought about Lisa one more time. She had always been proud of his willingness to help neighbors and strangers who needed assistance with their cars or their problems. Tonight he was going to attempt the most important repair job of his life, trying to fix a situation that was broken in the most fundamental way possible. "Wish me luck, sweetheart," David whispered into the cold night air, then began his careful approach toward the barn where Amy was waiting. David crept through the darkness toward Ray's barn, every sense heightened by adrenaline and the knowledge that Amy's life depended on his next few actions. The winter night was brutally cold, and his breath formed small clouds that he worried might give away his position. He moved from tree to tree using shadows and farm equipment as cover, just as he had been taught during basic training 40 years ago. The barn loomed larger as he approached, its weathered siding and patched roof visible in the pale moonlight. David could see light seeping through cracks around the edges of the building, which meant Ray had left some kind of illumination on inside. That could work for or against him, depending on whether it helped him see what he was doing or made him more visible to anyone watching. David circled the barn carefully, looking for the best way to enter without making noise. The main door was large and looked like it would creak on its hinges, but there was a smaller side door that might be quieter. He also noticed several windows, though most had been boarded up from the inside. Only one window high up near the loft still had glass in it. Before committing to any entrance, David wanted to confirm that Ray was indeed settled in the farmhouse for the night. He crept close enough to peer through the front window and saw the flickering blue light of a television in what appeared to be the living room. Ray was stretched out in a reclining chair, apparently watching late-night programming. David counted on having at least a few minutes before Ray made another check on his prisoner. David returned to the barn and tried the handle on the side door. It turned easily, but the hinges let out a soft squeal that sounded deafeningly loud in the quiet night. David froze, listening for any sign that the noise had been heard from the house. After a full minute of silence, he eased the door open just wide enough to slip inside. The interior of the barn was dimly lit by a single bulb hanging from an extension cord. David could see the makeshift rifle display where he had stood just hours earlier, but now the weapons took on a more sinister appearance. These weren't just hunting rifles, David realized. They were Ray's insurance policy, his way of making sure no one interfered with his secret activities. David moved quietly toward the back corner where he had seen Amy imprisoned behind the canvas partition. As he got closer, he could hear soft sounds, quiet breathing, the slight rattle of chains, the rustle of fabric. Amy was awake, probably too terrified and uncomfortable to sleep soundly. "Amy," David whispered as softly as possible. "It's David, I came back for you." The sound stopped immediately, then David heard Amy's voice, barely audible through the canvas barrier. "You came back," she said, and David could hear the tears in her voice. "I was afraid you wouldn't come back." "I promised I would," David replied, already pulling out his bolt cutters and looking for the best way to get through the partition. "I'm going to get you out of here." David found a gap between two pieces of canvas and carefully cut the rope that held them together. The opening was just large enough for him to squeeze through into Amy's makeshift prison. Up close, her condition was even worse than he had feared. She was clearly malnourished and dehydrated, and the chains around her ankles had caused raw wounds where the metal had rubbed against her skin. "How are we going to get past him?" Amy asked, nodding toward the direction of the farmhouse. "He has guns, and he's told me 100 times what he'll do to both of us if anyone ever finds me." "We're going to be very quiet and very careful," David said, examining the chains that held Amy captive. The shackles around her ankles were secured with heavy padlocks, but the chains themselves were bolted to the concrete floor with hardware that looked more vulnerable. "Can you walk?" Amy struggled to her feet using the wall for support. Her legs were shaky from months of limited movement, but she managed to stand. I think so. I've been trying to stay strong, doing exercises when he's not watching. David positioned the bolt cutters around the chain closest to the floor bolt. The tool was designed for cutting wire and small metal pieces, but he hoped it would be strong enough to break through at least one link of the chain. He squeezed the handles with all his strength, and after several attempts, one link finally snapped with a soft metallic pop. "One down," David whispered, moving to the second chain. This one was positioned at a more awkward angle, and David had to lie on his side to get the bolt cutters positioned properly. The cold concrete floor soaked through his jacket, but he managed to break through the second chain after several minutes of careful work. Amy was free from the floor bolts, but she still wore shackles around her ankles connected by about 3 feet of chain. She could walk, but not quickly or quietly. David wished he had thought to bring a file or hacksaw to remove the shackles completely, but there hadn't been time to plan for every detail. "Can you make it to my truck?" David asked. "It's about a mile through the woods. I'll make it," Amy said with determination. "I've been dreaming about getting out of here for so long. I'm not going to let a little walk stop me now." David helped Amy gather the few personal belongings Ray had left her: a sweatshirt, some socks, and a small photo that she clutched tightly. As they prepared to leave the barn, David realized they faced another challenge. How could they get past the farmhouse without being seen or heard? The direct route to David's truck would take them right past Ray's front windows. "Is there a back way off the property?" David asked. "Some route that doesn't go past the house?" Amy thought for a moment. "When he brought me here, I remember seeing a creek behind the barn. If we follow that, it might lead away from the house toward the road." David nodded. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was better than trying to sneak directly past Ray's living room window. He helped Amy through the gap in the canvas partition, then through the side door of the barn. The cold night air hit them immediately, and Amy shivered violently in her thin clothes. David gave Amy his jacket, knowing she needed it more than he did. She was so thin that the jacket hung on her like a tent, but it would provide some protection from the wind. They began moving slowly toward the back of the property, Amy's chains making soft clinking sounds with each step despite their efforts to muffle the noise. The creek Amy remembered was there, a narrow stream of water that had not yet frozen completely despite the winter weather. Following its course would indeed lead them away from the farmhouse, though it would also take them through rougher terrain that would be difficult for Amy to navigate in her weakened condition. They had made it about halfway to the creek when disaster struck. Amy, focused on watching where she stepped, didn't see the piece of farm equipment partially hidden in the tall grass. Her chained ankles caught on a metal projection, and she fell forward with a cry of pain and a loud rattle of chains. David immediately dropped to his knees beside her, helping her sit up and checking for injuries. Amy's hands were scraped and bleeding from trying to break her fall, and her left ankle was twisted, though not seriously. But the damage was done. The noise of her fall and her involuntary cry had been loud enough to carry across the quiet farmyard. In the distance, David could see lights coming on in the farmhouse. Ray had heard something, and he was investigating. David estimated they had maybe 2 minutes before Ray would come outside with a flashlight and possibly a weapon. "Can you run?" David asked urgently. Amy struggled to her feet, testing her twisted ankle. "I think so," she said, though David could see she was in considerable pain. They abandoned any attempt at stealth and began moving as quickly as possible toward the creek and the woods beyond. Behind them, David could see a flashlight beam sweeping across the barnyard as Ray began searching for the source of the noise he had heard. David supported Amy as much as possible, while still allowing her to move under her own power. Her ankle was slowing them down, but she was pushing herself harder than David would have thought possible for someone in her condition. The desperation to finally escape her months of imprisonment was giving her strength she didn't know she had. They reached the creek, just as Ray's voice carried across the farmyard, shouting threats and promises of what he would do when he found whoever was interfering with his property. David and Amy splashed across the shallow water and began climbing the bank on the far side, their movements now guided more by panic than planning. The woods offered them cover from Ray's flashlight, but the terrain was treacherous in the darkness. David used his own flashlight sparingly, just quick flashes to identify obstacles and find safe footing. They could hear Ray behind them, crashing through the underbrush and calling out warnings about what would happen to anyone stupid enough to trespass on his land. David's truck was still at least half a mile away, and Amy was beginning to falter. Her breathing was labored, and she was stumbling more frequently. David realized they might not make it to the vehicle before Ray caught up with them, despite their head start. "Listen to me," David said, stopping and taking Amy by the shoulders. "If something happens to me, if Ray catches us, I want you to keep running toward the road. Flag down any car you see and tell them to call the police." "Nothing's going to happen to you," Amy said fiercely. "We're both getting out of here." David admired her determination, but he could hear Ray getting closer behind them. David and Amy stumbled through the dark woods, branches scratching at their faces and Amy's ankle chains catching on fallen logs and underbrush. Behind them, Ray's flashlight beam swept back and forth, sometimes coming close enough that they had to drop to the ground and lie still until he moved past their hiding spot. Amy's breathing was becoming more labored with each step, and David knew she was running on pure adrenaline and willpower. Her body, weakened by months of captivity and poor nutrition, was reaching its limits. But every time David suggested they stop to rest, Amy shook her head and urged him to keep moving. "I can't go back there," she whispered, during one brief pause behind a fallen tree. "I won't survive another day in that place," David understood. Whatever Ray had put Amy through during her imprisonment had been so terrible that she would rather die in these woods than be recaptured. That knowledge gave David strength, too. This wasn't just about getting Amy to safety anymore. It was about making sure Ray could never hurt her or anyone else again. They could see David's truck through the trees when disaster nearly struck again. Ray had somehow gotten ahead of them, positioning himself between them and their escape route. David could see the man's silhouette in the moonlight, holding what appeared to be a rifle and scanning the tree line where David and Amy were hidden. "I know you're out there," Ray called into the darkness. "Whoever you are, you've made a big mistake. That girl belongs to me, and I'm going to get her back. But maybe we can work something out if you come out now and talk like reasonable people." David felt Amy trembling beside him, and he put his arm around her shoulders to steady her. Ray's voice carried a tone of fake reasonableness that made David's skin crawl. This was a man who had kidnapped and imprisoned a young woman for months, and he was talking about working things out as if this were some kind of business dispute. "What do we do?" Amy whispered so quietly David almost couldn't hear her. David studied their situation carefully. Ray was positioned near David's truck, but there was another vehicle nearby, an old farm truck that probably belonged to a neighbor. If they could circle around through the woods and reach that truck, they might have another escape option. But it would mean moving deeper into the forest, away from the main road where help might be available. Before David could decide on their next move, fate intervened in an unexpected way. A car came down the country road, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Ray immediately moved toward the road, probably hoping to convince any potential witnesses that everything was normal and they should keep driving. But the car slowed down when the driver saw Ray standing in the road with a rifle. David heard the car door slam and a woman's voice calling out, "Is everything okay out here?" I heard shouting. It was Margaret Peterson, David realized. She lived about 2 miles down the road and was probably returning home from her job at the late-night diner in town. Margaret was in her 60s, tough as nails, and not easily intimidated. She was also carrying something in her hand that David hoped was a cell phone. "Just dealing with some trespassers," Ray called back, his voice taking on that fake friendly tone again. Nothing to worry about. But Margaret wasn't buying it. "Mister, I don't know you, and I know every family on this road. You want to tell me why you're standing out here with a gun in the middle of the night?" David saw his opportunity. While Ray was distracted by Margaret, he and Amy could move toward the road from a different direction. If they could reach Margaret's car, they would have transportation and a witness who could testify about what she had seen. "Can you make it a little farther?" David asked Amy. She nodded, gritting her teeth against the pain in her ankle and the exhaustion that was threatening to overwhelm her. They began moving carefully through the trees, staying parallel to the road but hidden from view. As they got closer, David could hear more of the conversation between Margaret and Ray. Margaret was demanding to know whose property he was on and whether he had permission to be hunting at night. Ray was getting more agitated, his voice losing the pretense of friendliness. "Lady, you need to mind your own business and drive on," Ray said, raising his rifle slightly. That was a mistake. Margaret Peterson had lived through the Great Depression, raised 5 children as a single mother, and worked double shifts to put them all through college. She wasn't about to be intimidated by some stranger with a gun. "Young man, I'm calling the sheriff," Margaret announced, pulling out her cell phone. "Something's not right here, and I'm not driving anywhere until I know what's going on." Ray took a step toward Margaret, and David knew he had to act immediately. He couldn't let this brave woman get hurt because she had tried to help them. David broke from the tree line, calling out to distract Ray's attention from Margaret. "Ray, over here." Ray spun around, trying to locate David's voice in the darkness. In that moment of confusion, Margaret got back in her car and locked the doors, her cell phone already pressed to her ear as she called for help. "The sheriff's on his way," Margaret shouted through her car window. "And I've got your license plate number and a description of everything I've seen here." Ray was now caught between multiple problems. David was somewhere in the woods with his escaped prisoner. Margaret was a witness who could identify him and had already called the police, and help was coming whether he wanted it or not. David could see the panic setting in as Ray realized his carefully controlled situation had spiraled completely out of his hands. Amy appeared at the edge of the tree line, moving as quickly as her chains would allow toward Margaret's car. Margaret saw her immediately and threw open the passenger door. "Get in here, honey," Margaret called. "You look like you need help." Amy collapsed into the passenger seat, finally safe after months of captivity. Margaret took one look at the shackles around Amy's ankles and the condition she was in, and David heard her voice change from concerned neighbor to protective mother bear. "Sheriff Williams, this is Margaret Peterson on County Road 47, she said into her phone. "I need ambulance and backup units immediately. I've got what looks like a kidnapping victim, and there's a man with a rifle who's been threatening people." Ray had moved closer to Margaret's car, apparently hoping to regain control of the situation, but David emerged from the woods behind him. "It's over, Ray," David said quietly. "The police are coming. Amy's safe, and there's a witness who saw everything. Put the rifle down." For a moment, David thought Ray might actually comply. The man looked around at his deteriorating situation. The rescued prisoner, the witness, the incoming police sirens that were becoming audible in the distance. But then something seemed to snap inside Ray, and he raised his rifle toward David. David was ready. The months of grief and depression had made him reckless about his own safety, but seeing Amy's suffering had reminded him that some things were worth fighting for. He dove to the side as Ray fired, the bullet going wide in the darkness. Before Ray could fire again, David was on him. Despite being 20 years older, David's desperate strength and righteous anger gave him an advantage. They wrestled for control of the rifle, rolling on the ground beside Margaret's car. David could hear Amy screaming for him to be careful, and Margaret shouting into her phone for the police to hurry. The fight ended when the rifle discharged into the air during their struggle, and Ray's grip loosened enough for David to wrench the weapon away. By the time Sheriff Williams and his deputies arrived 5 minutes later, David was sitting on Ray's back, holding the rifle safely out of reach while Ray cursed and threatened everyone present. The next several hours were a blur of ambulances, police interviews, and media attention. Amy was rushed to the county hospital, where doctors confirmed that despite her ordeal, she was going to recover fully. Ray was arrested and charged with kidnapping, false imprisonment, and assault with a deadly weapon. A search of his property revealed evidence of at least 2 other missing persons cases that police had never connected to him. David found himself being called a hero by the local news stations, but he deflected the attention whenever possible. He insisted he had just done what anyone would have done in the same situation. What he didn't tell the reporters was how saving Amy had saved him too. For the first time since Lisa's death, David had a reason to get up in the morning and a sense that his life still had purpose and meaning. As dawn broke over the county hospital, David sat in the waiting room while doctors finished examining Amy. Margaret had stayed with them through the entire night, bringing coffee and offering comfort to both the rescued victim and the unlikely rescuer who had stumbled into the most important moment of both their lives. 1 year later, David stood in his living room on a bright Saturday morning in March, but the house no longer felt like the tomb it had become after Lisa's death. Sunlight streamed through clean windows, and the smell of fresh coffee and bacon drifted in from the kitchen, where Amy was preparing breakfast for their weekly visit. Amy had made remarkable progress in her recovery, both physically and emotionally. The first few months had been difficult, filled with nightmares, anxiety attacks, and the slow process of rebuilding trust in the world around her. But with the support of her family, professional counseling, and her unlikely friendship with David, she had gradually returned to living rather than merely surviving. "Breakfast is ready," Amy called from the kitchen, her voice bright and cheerful in a way that still amazed David sometimes. This was the same young woman who had been huddled in chains in Ray's barn, whispering desperate pleas for help through a gap in a canvas partition. David walked into the kitchen and found Amy setting places for 3 people. Margaret Peterson had become a regular part of their Saturday morning routine. The 3 of them bonded forever by that terrifying night when their lives had intersected in such a dramatic way. "Margaret's running late," Amy explained, checking her phone for messages. "She said something about having to cover an extra shift at the diner, but she'll be here as soon as she can." David nodded and took his usual seat at the kitchen table. Over the past year, this weekly breakfast had become one of the most important parts of his routine. Amy would drive up from the State University, where she had resumed her studies in social work, and they would spend the morning catching up on their lives, sharing stories, and simply enjoying each other's company. The relationship between David and Amy was hard for some people to understand. She was young enough to be his daughter, and they had met under the most unusual and traumatic circumstances imaginable, but their bond was based on something deeper than conventional friendship. They had saved each other in ways that went far beyond the physical rescue that night in February. Amy had given David a purpose when he needed it most, pulling him back from the edge of his own personal abyss. In return, David had given Amy her life back and shown her that there were still people in the world who would risk everything to help a stranger in need. Neither of them would ever forget what the other had done. "How's school going?" David asked as Amy joined him at the table with plates of eggs and bacon. "Really well," Amy said, her face lighting up with enthusiasm. "I'm doing my field placement at the women's shelter downtown, working with other survivors of kidnapping and abuse. It's hard sometimes listening to their stories, but it feels like the right place for me to be." David wasn't surprised that Amy had chosen to dedicate her career to helping other victims of violent crime. She had found a way to transform her own trauma into a force for healing and justice. Her professors said she had a natural gift for connecting with people who had experienced the kind of terror she understood firsthand. The trial had been difficult for Amy, requiring her to testify about her months in captivity and relive details she would rather forget. But Ray's conviction on multiple charges, including the cold cases that police had connected to him, had brought a sense of closure. He would spend the rest of his life in prison, never able to hurt anyone else the way he had hurt Amy and those other victims. Margaret arrived just as they were finishing breakfast, bustling in with her usual energy and carrying a bag of fresh pastries from the bakery in town. "Sorry I'm late," she said, giving both David and Amy quick hugs. "Had to help cover for someone who called in sick. And you know how Saturday mornings can be at the diner." Margaret had become something of a local celebrity after the events of that February night, though she downplayed her role whenever anyone brought it up. The newspapers had called her a hero for stopping to investigate suspicious activity and calling for help. But Margaret insisted she had just done what any decent person would do. As they sat around the table sharing pastries and coffee, David reflected on how much his life had changed. The crushing depression that had nearly led him to suicide hadn't disappeared entirely, but it no longer dominated every moment of his existence. He still missed Lisa terribly, but he had learned to carry that grief alongside other emotions, purpose, friendship, and even occasional joy. David had started volunteering with the local search and rescue organization, using his mechanical skills to maintain their equipment and his growing knowledge of missing persons cases to assist with investigations. He had also become a regular speaker at suicide prevention workshops, though he never explicitly mentioned his own plans from that dark February morning. Instead, he talked about the importance of finding meaning in helping others and how a single act of kindness could change multiple lives. "I have some news to share," Amy announced as they finished their pastries. "I got accepted into the graduate program at State. I'm going to get my master's degree in counseling, specializing in trauma recovery." David felt a surge of pride that was remarkably similar to what he imagined a father might feel when his daughter achieved an important goal. Amy had not only survived her ordeal but had found a way to use that experience to build a career, dedicated to helping others heal from similar trauma. "That's wonderful news," David said. "Lisa would have been so proud of you." Amy's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of gratitude rather than sadness. She had never met Lisa, but through David's story, she felt like she knew the woman who had shaped the man brave enough to risk everything for a stranger. Amy often said that Lisa's influence had been with David that night in the barn, guiding him toward the choice that saved both their lives. After Margaret left to return to work and Amy began gathering her things for the drive back to campus, she and David stood together on the front porch of the house where David had once planned to end his story. "You know what today is, don't you?" Amy asked quietly. David nodded. It was the anniversary of the night they had met, though neither of them ever called it that. They simply acknowledged it as the night when everything changed, when two broken people had found a way to help heal each other. "I think about it sometimes," Amy continued, "about what would have happened if you hadn't come to Ray's place that day. If you had chosen a different cellar, or a different day, or if you had just decided not to go through with your plan." David had thought about the same thing many times over the past year. The chain of events that had led him to Amy's rescue had been so unlikely, so dependent on perfect timing and circumstance, that it felt almost supernatural. If he had arrived at Ray's farm an hour earlier or later, if Ray hadn't been nervous enough to make those suspicious sounds, if Margaret hadn't chosen to drive down that particular road at exactly the right moment, everything could have turned out differently. "I don't think it was coincidence," David said. "I think Lisa was looking out for both of us that night." Amy squeezed David's hand. "I think so too." As Amy drove away, waving from her car window, David remained on the porch for a while longer. The afternoon sun was warm on his face, and he could hear birds singing in the trees that Lisa had planted around their property. Spring was coming early this year, and there were already tiny buds appearing on the branches. David thought about the rifle he had intended to purchase that day, the weapon that was supposed to end his pain but instead had led him to his most important purpose. That rifle was still in police evidence storage where it would remain until Ray's appeals were exhausted. David hoped he never saw it again. Instead of the quick final solution he had planned, David had found something better, a reason to continue living that honored both Lisa's memory and Amy's courage. He had learned that grief didn't have to be the end of the story, and that sometimes our darkest moments can lead us toward the most meaningful chapters of our lives. The house behind David was quiet but no longer empty. Amy's textbooks were stacked on the coffee table from her overnight stay, and Margaret had left her reading glasses on the kitchen counter again. The silence was peaceful rather than oppressive, filled with the presence of people who cared about each other and had chosen to build something positive. From the worst circumstances imaginable, David looked once more toward the chair where Lisa used to read her mystery novels, and for the first time in over a year, he smiled when he saw it. The chair was no longer a symbol of loss and loneliness. It was a reminder that love continues to guide us even after those we cherish are gone, sometimes leading us toward people and purposes we never could have imagined. As David went back inside to clean up the breakfast dishes, he was already looking forward to next Saturday morning, when Amy would return with stories from her classes and Margaret would arrive with fresh pastries and updates from the diner. They would sit around the kitchen table, three unlikely friends whose lives had been forever changed by a single night when despair had transformed into hope and darkness had given way to unexpected light.